So today we're joined by Dr. Kat Scott and Kirsty McKay. So Kat Scott is a research fellow at the University of Leeds and director of the Leeds Ecosystem Atmosphere and Forest Centre. So I'll let Kat get started.
Brilliant. Okay. So thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this series. It sounds like you've had some really interesting talks already, and hopefully I can just give a bit of an overview of some of the work that we've been doing here. I'm just going to start a timer so I don't go on too long. Yeah, so my name's Kat Scott and I'm a researcher and lecturer at the University of Leeds. And a lot of my work is around how trees and forests can help contribute to mitigating climate change. And that's, I suppose, the overarching theme that I'm going to be discussing today is how well we understand the ecosystem services that trees and woodlands in the UK specifically are providing, and how we go about quantifying them. Because some of this stuff, even though we have a relatively good understanding of it, we actually don't have particularly good ways of quantifying and monitoring the changes in these things. So there's a long list of people here who have contributed to this work over the past couple of years, because it really is it's a bit of a collection of a couple of different case studies. So I'm going to start by just outlining really where we are in terms of trees, woodlands and net zero in the UK, because that's one reason why we're interested in the ecosystem services or the natural capital that's provided by trees and woodlands. That's really been brought into kind of quite sharp focus in terms of their role in sequestering carbon and contributing to net zero. And then I'm going to talk about two specific case studies where we've used a combination of methodologies to try and answer questions about the trees and woodlands in specific places, whether that's the University of Leeds campus or the kind of broader Western North Yorkshire region. So at the moment, the UK has a woodland coverage of about 13%, and you can see on this map of the UK and the rest of Europe that it's a relatively low percentage compared to our European neighbours. Scotland actually has almost 20% woodland coverage, but England is much lower at only 10%. This is actually, despite being quite low now, this has actually increased from around 5% after the Second World War, after the First World War, sorry, but it's still some of the lowest kind of forest coverage in Europe. And I mention that because it means that potentially there's scope for us to be able to increase the area of woodland coverage and also increase the provision of the ecosystem services that these woodlands are providing. So in the UK at the moment, I've just taken from the Office for National Statistics, who do a sort of a natural capital accounting of the various ecosystem services and their values that are being provided by different parts of the natural environment. And so here I've pulled out their latest numbers for the value of the ecosystem services provided by woodlands in the UK. So along the bottom, we've got years from 2010 out to 2017. That's the most recent year that they've published values for at the moment. But what you can see from this is that as we go along through time, there are more and more different colours making up this bar. So that's not to say that these ecosystem services have only started happening now, but that they are only being quantified and valued now. Whereas 10 years ago, we were only really thinking about a couple of the major ecosystem services. You can see here as well that it's presented as a time series, so these values are different year to year. And that is not because there are huge fluctuations in the amount of woodland that we have, but it's more that there may be changes in the amount that these ecosystem services have been able to be active during that year. So flooding is probably a good example of that, where there's more opportunity for woodlands to contribute to flood prevention in some years than in others. The other aspect that varies is how we value these ecosystem services, and also simply changes to the actual pound value that we put on these services. So the the order of the bars here is a little bit confusing, I think, but actually the largest value for a single ecosystem service from woodlands at the moment in the UK is carbon sequestration. So that's the kind of red colour that's second on the vertical bars. And that's really what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this presentation, is specifically that role of carbon sequestration. And really the size of that bar is very, very sensitive to essentially the value that we put on carbon being sequestered in the UK. So I'm not going to dwell on the science behind this too much, because I think everyone's probably quite familiar with it, other than to say that the role that trees and woodlands play in sequestering carbon, it's more complicated than we probably tend to think of, in the sense that there's carbon taken in, but there's also carbon released, and it's really a balance between those that controls how much carbon is kind of accumulated over time by the ecosystem, how much of that carbon gets kind of taken down into the soil. And then as soon as we've got the kind of the combination or the provision of timber and wood products from forests, that also kind of plays a role in the amount of carbon that we can assume has been kind of locked away in trees and forests. So it really is a balance, and it's also not constant. If you plant a new forest, the amount of carbon that's being taken up, so that balance between these fluxes, varies over time. So we can't just assume that the kind of amount of carbon being sequestered by forests is constant. And the reason that this has become of particular interest, I think, in the last 5 or so years, I think we've always been conscious that trees and woodlands are taking in carbon, and that's a good thing from the perspective of the environment. But I think it's been brought into very sharp focus by the fact that, based on the most recent work from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to reach this level of net zero emissions by around the middle of the 21st century. And so if we aren't able to get our actual emissions down to completely zero, that implies that we are doing things to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's where I think there's been a lot of kind of renewed interest in the role of trees and forests in helping to do this, because at the moment, the other technologies that we might think of that could help us with that, we don't have ways of doing that at scale, in terms of kind of direct air capture and other more technological solutions to getting carbon out of the atmosphere. So I think trees are possibly being relied on a little bit too much to be able to do this for us, but I think that's kind of what's seen a real boost in interest around this ecosystem service in particular. And in terms of the UK, the Committee on, or the Climate Change Committee, as they are now, have looked at how the UK gets to net zero from all sorts of different perspectives. And in terms of their scenarios, where they look at how different things combine, their scenarios or their pathways rely on increasing the amount of woodland coverage we have in the UK from what it currently is at 13% to over 17%, by planting tens of thousands of hectares of new woodland every year. And this is a huge increase on what we've been doing in recent years and what we're currently doing. So this raises all sorts of questions around, we don't have thousands of hectares of spare land that we're not using for things at the moment. This is largely going to come from the agricultural sector. And so an understanding of the different ecosystem services that are provided by different land cover types is really critical here, because we've got to be able to weigh up the impact of changing from one land cover type to another. And so I'm just going to speak about 2 particular case studies where we were trying to answer questions that perhaps we might assume there were answers to already, but actually, in order to kind of to shine a bit of light on them, we had to kind of put together various different methodologies to do so. The first one was that on the University of Leeds campus, so I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the University of Leeds. It's a big campus on the outskirts of Leeds. This is an aerial image of the campus, and the the Sustainability Service and the estates teams were very interested in understanding the value or the services provided by the trees on campus, because they're often faced with situations where they are, for development reasons, maybe needing to remove trees, or for, you know, a tree has been damaged or it's posing a risk to health if it's deemed to be dangerous. And so they're often faced with a situation where the easiest thing to do is to remove a tree, but they just don't have that evidence to say, actually, let's not do that, and here's why. And so we conducted a survey of the university campus over 2 summers. It's actually about 5 years ago now that we did this, with a big team of volunteers. And this involved collecting various key kind of physical parameters about the trees. I'm not going to go through this in huge detail, but most of it is about trying to understand how the given tree that's in front of you differs from the average birch tree in this case. So we want to know, you know, the specifics about its size, any damage it's got, you know, specifics about its location. And all of that information we use to, with some software called iTree, which is like it's actually a suite of different software tools, used for understanding the benefits, the environmental benefits provided by trees, mainly in urban areas, but there's lots of different ways in which it's being applied. So as I say, we take those physical characteristics and use the software to basically compute for trees of different species with those characteristics, how much carbon is being sequestered by those trees, how much carbon is being stored, how much air pollution is being removed, and how much are those trees kind of intercepting rainfall runoff. And this was a big, it was a bit of a citizen science project in the end. We found that there were over 1,000 trees that we had to identify and measure, more than 100 different species. So we had a team of dedicated volunteers who I think learned quite a lot over those 2 summers, and we're really keen to get involved and help. And so one of the things that came out of that was, and if this is something that you're interested in finding out more details about, the link at the bottom of this screen at the moment will take you to the detailed report that we wrote about this. But this graph is really just to summarize that for the trees on campus, we could then work out how much carbon was being sequestered annually by each tree. And here I'm showing them the different colours represent different species. And so broadly, the bigger the tree, the more carbon it's sequestering. But you can see that within that general relationship, there's a lot of variation, and that comes from, firstly, from the different species, but also from things like the amount of light the tree receives, whether it's been damaged, whether it's got bits missing. So there's various ways that a tree can have its, you know, its full potential to sequester carbon. It can be reduced slightly by all sorts of different factors. So that's why you see that spread. But we found from doing this that actually all of the trees on campus were sequestering about the equivalent of the annual carbon footprint of only 6 people in the UK. And that really, I mean, so that was based on the carbon footprint in 2018. And so I think really that kind of puts into sharp focus the fact that the trees are doing a great job here. They are sequestering a lot of carbon, but at the moment, our carbon footprints as individuals are so much higher than we can really realistically expect the biosphere to be able to kind of compensate for us. And so even though they're storing and sequestering an awful lot of carbon, our carbon footprints are just kind of way out of balance with what can be taken up by these trees. And the reason I wanted to speak about that case study was that we then used the information that we gathered on the university campus to try and say something more broadly about carbon. I focused here on carbon sequestration, but we did look at carbon storage as well, so I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. And so the second piece of work was working with the local authorities across the White Rose Forest region. So the White Rose Forest is one of England's community forests, and it includes both West and North Yorkshire. And combined, it covers over 1 million hectares of land. So it's a really big area. You might have heard previously about plans to create a sort of northern forest that runs across the east to west from, across the north of England. And that is kind of made up of these different community forests from Mersey to Manchester, and then the White Rose Forest over on the east of the country. So it's a huge area. Currently, it's got about 11% tree canopy cover, so even lower than the average for England. And the thing here was that the local authorities in this region had kind of come together to really try and sort of push forward, understanding how much they had in terms of tree canopy cover, understanding how they could improve that, and how that would generate benefits for their region. And this all kind of came out of some work that we'd been doing with Leeds City Council specifically, where we'd looked at how the canopy cover kind of varied across the city itself. So, for those of you who are familiar with Leeds, you'll know it's has a fairly kind of dense urban centre where there's not a lot of tree canopy cover. But actually, once you get to the outskirts of the city, it gets pretty rural actually, within the boundaries of the Leeds local authority. So we found that the city had about 17% tree canopy cover, and that this was split pretty much 50-50 between trees inside woodlands and trees outside woodlands. And the distinction there it's a size classification. So a woodland is classified as being kind of a block of trees greater than half a hectare. And that comes from the National Forest Inventory that Forest Research put together, where they're sort of quantifying the area of woodland in the UK. So the numbers I presented at the start in terms of the ecosystem services generated by woodlands in the UK, that's based on that area that they work out. And so it was interesting to note that the trees outside woodlands were comprising about half of the canopy cover, but they weren't really being factored into these estimates of the ecosystem services being provided. So, as I said, we looked at Leeds initially and found that the split was about 50-50. So we expanded this to the rest of the White Rose Forest region and looked at that split between woodlands and the non-woodland trees. And broadly across the region, we found that about 40% of the total tree canopy cover was coming from trees outside woodlands. And again, that's based on the National Forest Inventory definition. And so as well as assessing their ecosystem services from a sort of natural capital perspective, this is also relevant to the UK's greenhouse gas inventory, which will quantify the amount of carbon that's being taken up through the process of land use change and the existing land cover. And again, that's using the National Forest Inventory in terms of woodlands that are greater than half a hectare in size. So so having an understanding of what else there is was really important. You can see that the different local authorities, this varied massively. So a couple of the North Yorkshire local authorities actually only had about 20% trees outside woodlands because they were very rural, had an awful lot of kind of large scale woodlands. And the reason that we were really sort of looking at this was to try and understand if we could make an estimate for how much carbon these trees were sequestering and storing, because that wasn't really being done. And when these local authorities are thinking about, firstly, how to expand their tree canopy cover, but also how to protect the tree canopy cover that they already have, not having this information in terms of the services that these trees are providing is really a bit of an obstacle for them. So we tried to develop a way of estimating the carbon sequestration and storage based on the information that we had, which was the work that we'd done previously, which would tell us for a tree of a given size, how much carbon do we expect it to sequester. And then what we also had was aerial imagery of the whole region, which gave us some of the tree characteristics. So what this image on here is showing is the kind of crown area of the trees in this data set. So from this, we could understand the area of canopy, and we could also understand the height of each tree. But for those of you who are more familiar with trees and terrestrial carbon cycle, the thing you really want to know about a tree is actually the diameter of its trunk. That's one of the key things that we needed for the iTree work. And so actually, unfortunately, what we've got from the aerial imagery are not necessarily the characteristics that we need. But what we can do is try and relate those back to the trees that we do have all of this information for, in order to try and make an estimate for the whole region. So what that basically involved was trying to match up the trees where we'd measured all of the things that I mentioned in the previous section, and match them up with this remotely sensed data set, so that we could understand how to relate back the amount of carbon that was being sequestered and stored by a tree of a particular size, even if we only know the characteristics that come from the aerial imagery, so the kind of the canopy cover from the top. And so this was obviously we're working with a limited data set here, because we only had the sort of 1,000 or so trees that were present on the university campus. And then we had a bit of work to do to actually spatially match them up. That was more difficult than we might have thought it would be. And so then relating those values to each other meant that we could, in situations where we only have the aerial imagery, we can then estimate what the carbon sequestered and stored might be. And so we did that for each of our local authorities in the White Rose Forest region. So this is all about their existing tree canopy cover. So we've used the aerial imagery and we've looked from above to say, okay, this is what the canopy coverage is. And then we've used Forest Research's National Forest Inventory to remove the woodland trees, so that all that's left are these trees that are kind of classified as being outside woodlands. And then by applying the relationship that we established from our campus kind of pilot study, we could extrapolate how much carbon those trees outside woodlands across the region were storing. And I know that figures in terms of kilotons of carbon dioxide a year don't necessarily mean a great deal out of context, but we looked at how this related to the carbon dioxide emissions from these local authorities, and collectively the amount of carbon that the trees were taking up, so this is just the trees outside woodlands, was equivalent to about 2% of their annual carbon dioxide emissions. So, and that might sound small, but in terms of something that's currently not being quantified and accounted for, it's actually quite a big contribution. And so it's something that we're really keen to kind of drill down a little bit more into and understand in more detail. So in terms of trees and woodlands in the UK, as I say, I've focused here really on one ecosystem service, which is carbon sequestration, and that I think is driving a lot of attention at the moment in terms of tree planting. But of course, there are many other reasons why you might want to plant trees and create woodlands. In terms of climate mitigation, creating woodlands can only contribute really meaningfully to getting to net zero if we are able to cut our greenhouse gas emissions massively. And I'm sure that's something that this audience would be completely familiar with, but it's always something that I feel like we have to emphasize when talking about carbon uptake from trees and forests. It certainly isn't going to solve the whole problem. In this work, we wanted to focus in on an ecosystem service that isn't really quantified and isn't really valued. So we were interested particularly in the trees outside woodlands, and found that across the White Rose Forest region, they are making up about 40% of the tree canopy cover, and actually annually taking up around the equivalent of 2% of the region's carbon dioxide emissions. But we have had to base this purely on the kind of set of trees that we had lots of information for. So we're assuming here that we can apply that relationship at a larger scale. But of course, it would be beneficial to have much more field data that's collected at the same time as the aerial imagery, so that we can draw out those relationships from measurements collected at the same time. And that would enable us to kind of make more robust projections, I think, over large areas and into the future. So I'll leave it there and just thank you very much for your attention. I've put some of our Twitter links on there, but I can also post my email address if anybody wants to get in touch about any of that specifically. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Kat. And yeah, we'll get on to questions at the end. And so next, we've got Kirsty, who is Head of Operations at Highland Rewilding.
Hi, everybody. I'll just try and share my screen now, 2 seconds. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to join you, and it was really interesting to listen to Kat's talk there. I'm quite excited to share that with our science team because we're also looking at carbon and woodland, so that'll be really interesting to them. So I'm Kirsty Mackay, the Head of Operations at Highland Rewilding Limited. This is a company based at Bunloit Estate on the banks of Loch Ness, which you can see in the background there, and also Beldorney Estate by Huntley in Aberdeenshire. Highland Rewilding was founded by Jeremy Leggett. So Jeremy has quite a long career in climate campaigning and as a social entrepreneur. He also played quite a key role in the solar revolution in terms of bringing his solar company, Solar Century, from a startup through to an international solar company. So now he's turning his hand to nature recovery through Highland Rewilding Limited. So it's been a really exciting and fast-moving project to be a part of. I'm just going to give you an overview today of what we've been up to over the past couple of years. So to start with, just some context about the company. So our aim is to enable nature recovery and community prosperity through rewilding at scale. We aim to do this through a research and data-led approach to applying that to most things that we do. So we really want to investigate how best to accurately monitor the biodiversity and carbon sequestration and storage on the land that we manage. So gathering baseline data to then inform our land management decisions, and then again measuring the impact of these land management interventions on biodiversity and carbon, hopefully resulting in increases. By doing this, we hope to inform the developing standards and metrics around natural capital markets, such as biodiversity and carbon, and also government policies. So we've been in quite frequent communication with organisations such as Nature Scot and the Scottish Government, and a wide range of other networks and organisations involved in this developing field. Another purpose of the kind of evidence-based approach is by building this evidence base for what we're doing, we hope to increase confidence in the financial sector to invest in business plans such as ours that include nature recovery and natural capital. So really trying to contribute to that mobilisation of private finance that is needed into nature recovery to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis at the speed and the scale that is necessary. Community engagement and involvement is also very important to Highland Rewilding, and we've been doing our best to develop this as we go. So some key areas that we look to engage with communities and involve them in rewilding is through employment. So I'll talk a bit more about all the community engagement later, but going from 2 estates with very low or no employment to a team of around 22 overall now, with quite a few of those local to the estates. Also through collaborations with local high schools and generally gathering input and feedback to inform our land management planning. I'll talk a bit more about co-ownership later when I go into a little bit of the finances of the company, and then we're quite keen to explore potential future joint ventures in terms of enterprise with local communities. And finally, what does rewilding mean to us? Because I'm aware it can be have a lot of different meanings depending on the context. So for us, it's very much about people and nature. We are keen to explore the benefits that rewilding can bring in terms of employment and enterprise and boosting local economies. Also, it's not just about leaving the land to get on with it to us. You know, where nature is doing well, we absolutely will leave it alone. But if we collect enough evidence and are confident that by intervening we can help boost nature recovery to increase carbon and carbon sequestration and biodiversity, then we will do. Yep, also developing the land management model to be for nature recovery that is economically viable, so that this is going to be possible to do large scale. And just talking about scale there, the way that we hope to scale as a company is through two avenues. So vertically, through acquiring further land to apply locally appropriate versions of the model on, and also horizontally by providing a platform service to other landowners, which I'll talk about later on. So just talking about scale, you can see the Scottish Government targets here in terms of biodiversity and carbon. Obviously, a huge amount of action is needed quickly to achieve these, but absolutely necessary. And you can see at the bottom the £20 billion funding gap identified by the Green Finance Initiative to achieve these goals. So the need to really mobilise private finance, as I was saying. So Highlands Rewilding, we hope our model can sort of, you know, contribute to reaching these targets in Scotland. I thought it might be useful to give a bit of a timeline of the company and how we came about. So started in March 2020 when Bunloit Estate was purchased by Solar Sanctuary. This was the company set up by Jeremy to be the initial company to purchase land for the project. This was financed partially through the proceeds of the sale of Solar Sanctuary, the solar company, but also through debt investment from a network of high net worth individuals that Jeremy had built up over the years. Then in the first year of the project, we didn't do anything on the land and took a full year to confer widely with a range of experts and organisations in the various areas involved in rewilding and land management. So we wanted to build up a good knowledge base first and create all these really valuable connections before getting started. We also reached out to the local community and established contacts there. So then in 2021, we carried out our baseline carbon and biodiversity surveys at Bunloit, engaging with a range of contractors to look at a wide range of methods to do this. Our team also grew, and Solar Sanctuary purchased Beldurnie, which was the second estate that I mentioned, and this is part of our scaling. So in autumn of 2021, we had a community open evening at Beldurnie to meet the local community and to introduce the project and hear some feedback from them. I forgot to mention we also at Bunloit earlier in 2021 had carried out a community consultation online during COVID. By COP 2021, we had our first natural capital report ready from the baseline data that we'd gathered, and also the Forest of Hope partnership was announced. So this was a collaboration between Highlands Rewilding Climate Action at COP and the Cabrach Trust, which is a rural regeneration charity local to Beldurnie. And the idea is that the Forest of Hope would be a legacy woodland of COP, and that each subsequent COP would have further legacy woodlands elsewhere in the country and in the world. So the first trees for that were planted this year, which is exciting. So on to Highlands Rewilding as a company. Highlands Rewilding was set up as a mass ownership company to enable scaling of the project. And so the first fundraising round closed at the end of the financial year. This was a founding funders round in which we approached high net worth individuals, and quite a lot of the existing investors rolled over their debt investment into equity. So this fundraising round enabled Highlands Rewilding to purchase the land from Solar Sanctuary, so that the company was set up as a mass ownership company with shareholders that owned the land that it was going to be operating on. Then this year we carried out our second year of monitoring at Bunloit and also carried out baseline surveys at Beldurnie, and a board was put in place for Highlands Rewilding to establish the governance. We had further community events this year with walk and talks on the estates, which was really great to do following COVID restrictions, actually to get members of the community up to the estates and to walk around with them, update them on what we've been up to, and crucially to gather feedback to inform land management planning. So recently we've been collating our survey results for the second natural capital report, which will be coming out soon, and preparing for a second fundraising round, this time including crowdfunding. So I'll talk about that a bit more later on. I thought I would touch on the baseline surveys at Bunloit, just to explain a little bit more about how we went about that. So for the carbon baseline, we used a mixture of tier 2 modelling methods and also sort of tier 3 granular direct measurements of what's there. For the woodlands, we used modelling through the Woodland Carbon Code by inputting data such as our species mix and estimated yield, and then modelling the carbon stocks from that. We also engaged with Climate Solutions Exchange, which is a contractor that use LiDAR surveying, which, as far as I can understand, is lasers from drones to measure ranges. And that's a way to actually accurately measure the biomass of the trees on the ground, and therefore calculate a carbon level. For the peatlands, we carried out peat depth surveys. So for the tier 2 kind of modelling, we engaged with the University of the Highlands and Islands and the James Hutton Institute to convert the peat volume measurements into an estimate of carbon levels of organic matter through using bulk density values from scientific literature. But we also engaged with TerraMotion, which is a contractor that uses satellite data. So I found this so interesting. They looked at satellite data, 5 years historic satellite data of our peatlands at Bunloit, and it's looking at the surface motion. So it's a phenomenon termed bog breathing. So peatland over time, the surface will move up and down, and the long-term surface motion trend is indicative of how healthy a peatland is. So if there's a net uplift over time, the bog's doing well and is storing carbon. Whereas if there is a net decrease, then it just suggests that the peatland is degrading and emitting carbon. Then moving on to our grasslands, for the tier 2 modelling, we were looking at carbon stock and flux values associated with the habitat type, but then we also complemented that by working with AgriCarbon, who took soil cores to get a direct measurement of the soil organic carbon. I just thought I would go over some of the key findings. If you're interested to hear in much more detail, you can definitely go onto our website, which is highlandsrewilding.co.uk, and download the full natural capital report. But so starting off, just you can see the number there about the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent stored in the peatlands, woodlands and grasslands, equating to roughly 2% of Scotland's annual footprint. So just highlighting the potential of the ecosystems to store carbon, and you know that we should be restoring them to maximise this potential. Also, quite shocking to me actually, given that Bunloit is quite a diverse mix of habitats and seems, you know, relatively healthy. It's actually a carbon source overall due to the degrading peatlands. This is because of the plantations on peat you can see in the background there. They have been drying out the peat and causing it to emit carbon. So this informed one of our first land management decisions, which was to clear fell the plantations on peat, and then I've been engaging with Peatland Action to develop a peatland restoration plan. And then also the plan in the future would be to plant and through natural regeneration create more diverse broadleaf woodland elsewhere on the estate to balance out that carbon stock loss from the plantations. Interestingly as well, when looking at the comparison between tier 2 and tier 3, data, we saw that the LiDAR was giving slightly different results to the Woodland Carbon Code modelling, where it was measuring the trees as being taller than estimated with the Woodland Carbon Code, but also fewer trees. That was quite interesting, just to highlight the sort of discrepancies there. And what's really exciting about the LiDAR work is that we had Climate Solutions Exchange back recently to carry out terrestrial laser scanning, which is a ground-based method to get a 3D image of each tree, including the branching structure. So we expect to see from this higher above ground levels of carbon compared to the Woodland Carbon Code estimates, especially in our broadleaf woodlands with that branching structure taken into account. So that'll be really interesting to find out. Moving on to the biodiversity baseline, we engaged with a range of contractors again to conduct surveys and measure our biodiversity on the estate. So Spot.it carried out satellite mapping of the estate to get an initial ecological map of the estate. And we engaged with Naturmetrics to carry out environmental DNA sampling, which also really cool, forensics of the environment to give an indication of the different species that are present there. Also, a network of camera traps around the estate, and we had Plant Life UK came to conduct a full floral community assessment We also carried out fauna surveys through local ecologists, Wychwood Environmental and Dan Puplet. They were working with our rangers and some student interns over the summer to conduct a full range of fauna surveys. So some key findings from that. Plant Life identified the site as an important site for lichen and bryophyte populations. So because of Bunlight's location between quite a wet oceanic wet coast climate and the more central highland climate, it was a really good spot for lichen communities to thrive, particularly in the ravines in our ancient woodlands, where there's a microclimate there from the shelter, the humidity, and high light levels from the west, just creating a really beneficial environment for lichen and bryophyte communities to thrive. So we'll be looking to maintain and protect those habitats. In the oak woods, they found an even age structure. So it seems like the oak woods were planted, but a long time ago, because there is the presence of lichen species that indicate ancient woodlands. So because of this even structure and a high level of deer grazing, there's quite low natural regeneration going on in the oak woodlands. So the implication for this in terms of management is that we're considering in future potentially doing some thinning to create light and space, and also we manage our deer population on the estate. So hopefully the combination of this can increase the potential for more diverse structure and a higher level of natural regeneration. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the environmental DNA results showed a lower biodiversity in the plantations compared to other habitats on the estate. So that's the monoculture conifer plantations, not just those on Peak, but there were some elsewhere on the estate as well. So combined with the carbon results to do with the peatland plantations, and also just with a sort of consensus among the people that we were conferring with that this would be a good idea, the long-term biodiversity, for long-term and carbon biodiversity and carbon gains, we decided one of our first interventions would be to fell the plantations, and then, as I said before, to replant and encourage natural regeneration of diverse native broadleafs on the estate. The grasslands were identified as being unimproved grasslands, so they've been left undisturbed for a long time in terms of fertiliser use, and so have a good potential for restoring species richness. The implication of this has been that we've been getting set up recently to graze the Highland cattle that are on the estate in a more strategic way. So we've been taking guidance from Grampian Graziers. They are our head of regenerative agriculture at Beldorney, where they already graze their cattle there in a planned, holistic manner with the rotational grazing, where they graze an area intensely and then leave it to rest and move on, which has already shown increases in biodiversity there just observationally, and we hope to do the same at Bunlight. So I'll just touch a little bit more on the community engagement and involvement. So we've been trying to do this as we go, and so from the beginning have reached out to local communities and built a network of contacts there, including community organisations. Also, just to introduce the project and gather feedback as we go, we had the initial consultation at Bunlight, which was actually focused on some ideas for a small level of eco-building on a previously clear-felled area of the estate. We were just consulting on ideas to see if this was something the community might be interested in. And it was a really interesting exercise in learning, the best ways of community engagement and consultation. So this was during COVID, and we had an online website and held webinars. We had an active Q&A forum. So it was really interesting to do that. As I mentioned, we had our walk and talks as well recently to gather more feedback and to update the communities about what we've been up to. One of the most positive aspects of our community engagement has been the relationship we've built with the local high school at Bunlight. So we've run a series of outdoor education and environmental science classes for about a year now, where the classes come to the estate weekly and the rangers have them carrying out a variety of different activities, such as they were involved in the peat depth surveys, other surveys, they've been planting a food forest, bird box building, and it's just been really great to hear the feedback from the pupils and the teachers. From that also, we had work experience. We had a pupil from the school come up.
Okay, well, we can move on to a few questions then, just while we let Kirsty try and rejoin. We've got one for Kat, which is, please could you confirm whether the statistics about sequestering the equivalent CO2 emissions of 6 people per year was per tree or for all of the trees combined on the campus?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was for all of the trees combined. So it was about, yeah, the total of those kind of 1,400 trees. What we did find was that the, oh, no,
Hi, sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out there.
That's all right. You've kind of frozen on the screen. I don't know if
Okay.
you want to try turning your camera on and off and see if that.
Is that a bit better?
I can hear you. I just
Okay.
don't.
Should I
But your
try
videos.
sharing again?
Yeah, you can give it a go. Sorry about that, Kat.
Sorry, just Wi-Fi issues.
No, that's absolutely fine.
Can you see that again now?
Oh, yes, I can see you're moving
Okay.
again, and yeah, that's better.
And you've got the presentation up?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just I'll carry on from there if that's okay. I've only got a couple of slides
Yeah,
left.
that's absolutely fine.
So I'm not quite sure where I got to. Did you hear quite a bit of this slide about the community engagement?
Yeah, I think you got to the bit about the school and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. And I think I'll maybe just move on from here. I think that probably gives a bit of a good insight into that, just so I can cover the other parts. So I was going to end the presentation by talking a bit about the finances and how we hope to make the business plan ethically profitable to demonstrate that, you know, we can manage the land in this way of nature recovery and it be economically viable. So the first two income streams there are the biodiversity uplift credits and the carbon credits that we would hope to be generating from the increases in biodiversity and carbon that we generate. And we would not be selling these credits until year 5 of the business plan, partially to allow time for the biodiversity metrics and markets to establish further. Also to further progress our data collection so that we could have really verifiable credits by that point, and also just to wait potentially for the price to increase. A more immediate income stream that we're looking at is the platform service that I mentioned before, where we feel we're at a point now with the experience over the past couple of years in collecting this data and actually managing the land with interventions informed by the data. We also have the in-house expertise now of our science and data team and the ecology expertise of the rangers. You know, we think we're well set up now to offer a service to other landowners to help them tap into the natural capital markets to be able to manage land for nature recovery. Again, a more immediate income stream is ecotourism. So we currently have some holiday cottages already on the estates and looking at the potential to expand ecotourism at Beldurnie through yurt structures and things like that. Eco building is something we will be looking at wherever it's locally appropriate. So low carbon homes on the estates. And nature recovery retreats is again a more immediate income stream that we're looking at. So corporate teams could come to the estates and immerse themselves in the nature, learn about what we're doing, also take part in some of the restoration work. We've got a good property, Ardaki Lodge at Bunloit. You can see there at the bottom a really good workshop space that we've been using as a team and with other organisations already that would be well set up for this. Other income streams we're looking at are probably lower level, but renewable energy opportunities, solar PVs, things like that. Regenerative agriculture, we hope to expand at Beldurnie through inclusion of horticulture as well, and sustainable forestry wherever that might be appropriate. So the final slide, just to talk a bit about our second fundraising round, which has now begun and will run through to February. So 3 categories of investors this time. We're looking again at high net worth individuals and financial institutions, this time hoping to leverage equity with debt from banks. And also the most important part in terms of the mass ownership and the reason for setting up Highland Rewilding as a mass ownership company is that we'll be running a crowdfund campaign launching in December to approach this third category of investor of everyday investors, citizen rewilders. So the crowdfund would have a low minimum investment, and we hope that local people to the estates and also wider in Scotland might want to invest in the company to co-own Highland Rewilding and the rewilding land. If the business plan goes to plan, you know, that would then mean eventually an ethical return on investment, and so a way of getting profits potentially back into local communities as well. we know it's not a perfect model, but as a private company, it's a way that we can tackle land ownership inequality. And we think it lies somewhere between, full community ownership, which would be the ideal, and fully private ownership. So that's exciting, starting next month. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry for the disruption there.
Thanks very much to both of the speakers. They were really, really informative and interesting talks. So yeah, I'll go back onto the questions. And if anyone wants to ask in person as well, just put your hand up and you can do that as well. But so I think, Kat, you answered the first question that we went to just while we were waiting. So thank you for that. And then there's another one for Kat, which is there a significant difference between services provided by in-forest trees? Is the sequestration equivalent for the 60% of forestry canopy cover?
Yeah, I think the quick answer is it depends on the service. So some of them will vary a lot for kind of isolated trees in towns and cities. You can imagine the amenity value of those trees is very different to a tree in a forest potentially. In terms of the carbon, if you imagine at the moment you'd have quite a lot of scattered, in reality, all your trees outside woodlands are scattered all over the place. But if you imagine them being kind of stuck together and forming a hectare of trees, what you would have are, rather than sort of dense continuous canopy, you might have a much, much lower number of trees that would be bigger, but they still occupy a hectare once you've kind of combined them. So the amount of carbon in there isn't going to vary hugely, but it's knowing how that it's knowing really how that hectare is kind of distributed, being able to quantify that in order to give you your carbon stored, because for individual trees it's going to vary a lot depending on whether whether you've got essentially big mature trees or very small saplings. So sorry, that's a bit of a fluffy answer, but yeah, it depends.
And I suppose I was thinking of a similar one along those lines, just about, are the like non-woodland trees often omitted from these kind of calculations then?
Yeah, so it really depends what you're looking at. There are some things where people do value, particularly amenity values, for urban trees for non-woodland trees. So they might be, specifically calculating them for that. The area I think they really are missing is when we think about kind of national scale carbon sequestration from woodlands. That tends to be done for those woodlands that are greater than half a hectare. And part of it's because it's just really difficult to quantify where these non-woodland trees are. I know Forest Research are doing work on that to include them as well. But at this point, it's not clear how you would estimate kind of future carbon sequestration from trees that aren't in woodlands, because like Kirsty mentioned, you can use the Woodland Carbon Code for woodlands and project that forwards, but actually for these non-woodland trees, it's more complicated.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got one for Kirsty, which it says, have you got an opinion on the biodiversity impact of the hydro project currently taking place in the Great Glen, which is south of your area of interest?
I don't think we have sort of formed an opinion of that as a company, so yeah, not too much to say on that one. I suppose it's just trying to get the balance, isn't it, between renewable energy and also biodiversity and that kind of holistic restoration of ecosystems to try and get all these kind of benefits in terms of tackling these crises. But our sort of approach to the land that we manage is kind of a biodiversity first approach, because we sort of are thinking that if we create diverse habitats, that then leaves a lot of options open for other benefits by having the diverse habitats in the first place. But obviously in terms of renewable energy and trying to supply that at scale, there's going to be those challenges.
Okay, thanks. And then there's another question, which is the carbon taken up and emitted by inland waters included in the carbon budget for terrestrial ecosystems? And I guess, I don't know if you have the answer to that, Kat, but or Kirsty, I meant both of you could probably answer that one.
So it's not something we've looked at yet, but there actually is. So there's a River Deveron that goes through Baldorney and part of Loch Ness is included in Bunloit Estate, so we haven't yet really explored the freshwater ecosystems, and so I'm really keen to hear any thoughts on that.
Yeah, similarly, my experience has been simply with above ground vegetation. So yeah, I'm not sure either.
And any other questions from anybody? I don't think there's any more on the Slido. I was just wondering, Kirsty, about you're talking about the kind of the carbon and biodiversity markets, and do you kind of know like how you would get those started and what the kind of opinions are from the local contractors?
Yeah, so for carbon, there's markets established already in terms of the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code. There's ways to verify your carbon increases. So we're actually not looking to do the Peatland Carbon Code at Bunloit with our peatlands, just because most of it is forest bog, which isn't yet eligible. And so financially just doesn't really make any sense, but that's obviously an option there. In terms of Woodland Carbon Code, that's definitely something we're looking at. So the Forest of Hope, which I mentioned, is registered with the Woodland Carbon Code, ready to progress there. In terms of biodiversity, we obviously don't yet know what the biodiversity metrics might end up being. So our approach is to really try and work out the best way to measure the biodiversity on the estate most effectively and try and get as much data as we can, but also not just any data, sort of useful data in terms of getting a good indication of biodiversity. So trying to figure that out and then keeping our options open basically by measuring it in that way.
Thanks very much. And we've ended up reaching the end of the time on the call. It doesn't look like there's any other questions either. So just wanted to say again, thanks so much for joining us. That's been really, really useful for us all. And we'll let you know when we get the link online to the recording.